Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Dan Berger. I am a professor here at UW and co-director of the UW Labor Studies Colloquium, which is sponsoring this talk. I want to thank the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies for their support. Sorry, just more people joining. I want to thank the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies for their support. This event is part of the Labor in Times of Crises event series that we've been running here at UW Labor Studies Colloquium. Our next event will be March 7th, next Monday at 1:15 p.m. with Professor Ruben Miller speaking about race, punishment, and the afterlife of mass incarceration. We'll be putting some more information about how you can register for that event in the chat. And feel free to contact me if you'd like more information about that event. But for now, I'm very excited to turn to today's event. So among other things, COVID-19 is a workplace issue. It has closed some workplaces and shown the dangers of certain jobs that are often taken for granted. It has also sparked dramatic attempts to unionize around the country. The pandemic has consistently illustrated the connections between employment and other forms of social insecurity, including housing, food, and healthcare. But what if it didn't have to be this way? While the 2020 uprisings had the abolition of police violence as their immediate target, the demand to defund the police called to mind the civil rights movement insistence that a budget is a moral document. For that reason, the last 75 years of the Black freedom movement have demanded safe, unionized, remunerated employment. We would do well to remember that the full name of the legendary 1963 civil rights demonstration was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Likewise, while pundits debate inflation and labor shortages for unsafe and poorly paid jobs, we might shift our attention to House Resolution 145, which would establish a federal jobs guarantee if enacted. That resolution was introduced last year by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. In putting it forward, Representative Pressley said it would fulfill the economic agenda put forward by people such as Sadie Alexander, the nation's first Black economist, and Coretta Scott King, among many others. So today, we'll be hearing about that history and ongoing efforts to establish a federal jobs guarantee with Ibrahim and David Stein. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then turn the floor over to them, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Ibrahim is the former economic policy advisor to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressely and currently serves as a policy advisor with the National Economic Council. David Stein is a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and author of the forthcoming book, Fearing Inflation, Inflating Fears, The Civil Rights Struggle for Full Employment and the Rise of the Carceral State, 1929 to 1986. And both of them contributed to drafting House Resolution 145. So without further ado, I'm going to let David take it away on the history of full employment, and then we'll turn to Aya talking about some of its contemporary questions and discussions.
Awesome, thank you, Dan. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and then get going. Okay, can you all see that okay? Awesome. Okie doke. So one of the most important goals of the civil rights movement was the quest for full employment, which they pursued via a federal job guarantee. Since the 1930s and 40s and through the rise of the modern civil rights movement, civil rights activists have pointed out the deep disparities that result from economic recessions and how these magnified already existent labor market inequalities. Civil rights activists thus called for a coordinated federal effort to attain full employment as a means of achieving a more just and equitable economy. These efforts would help craft the Employment Act of 1946 and the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978. The thrust of both of these laws was greater participation in monetary and fiscal policy by the American people and greater collaboration between economic institutions, including the Federal Reserve, to represent the public interest by achieving full employment, which in contrast to many of the ways that the term is currently used, for them, this meant a situation where everyone who wanted a job could find them at good wages, with good working conditions, and where people were located. The call for full employment arose during the Great Depression and the winding down of World War II. As many people looked out toward the end of the war, it was unclear whether a return to the peacetime economy would also return all working people, especially women and communities of color, to the precarious economic conditions that they'd experienced before the war. Likewise, the war had demonstrated that with political will, the government had a host of options available for manufacturing goods and services, doing things that the market would not necessarily do. In the mid-1940s, ideas about full employment enjoyed a broad consensus. It wasn't just civil rights and labor activists who argued for full employment. When Fortune magazine ran a poll that asked, do you think the federal government should provide jobs for everyone able and willing to work, but who can't get a job in private employment? 68% of respondents said yes. This was especially important for Black workers. As a coalitional statement of leading Black activists, including Thurgood Marshall, Sadie Alexander, and A. Philip Randolph wrote, in evaluating the merits of parties and candidates, we must include that all issues touching the life of Black people as a group, as well as those affecting the entire country. The party or candidate who refuses to help control prices or fails to support the extension of Social Security or refuses to support a progressive public program for full post-war employment or opposes an enlarged and unsegregated program of government-financed housing or seeks to destroy organized labor is as much the enemy of Black people as he who would prevent Black people from voting. For many constituencies, full employment was the key issue on the post-war agenda. So what happened? The wide-ranging social consensus soon led to the introduction of the Full Employment Bill of 1945, which then ran up against the political and the racial constraints of Jim Crow America. That bill, the 1945 bill, emphasized that all Americans able to work and seeking work have a right to useful, remunerative, regular full-time employment. The bill passed the Senate 71-10 before it was met with opposition in the House, where it ultimately faltered due to Midwestern Republicans and Southern Democrats. The power of these politicians like Carter Manasco and William Whittington to derail the proposed Full Employment Bill of 1945 was premised on Jim Crow voting exclusions. Let's take Manasco, for example. The chair of the House Expenditures Committee came from Alabama's 7th District. Elections there often brought out less than 10% of the population. He presided over the home of Coretta Scott King's family in Perry County, as well as many of the pivotal sites of the struggle of the future voting rights struggle, including Selma, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama. I think it's fair to say that in 1945, this district fell far short of anything resembling a democracy. Seeking to maintain the racial and economic structure of the region, Manasco opposed the bill on the grounds that farm workers might leave in search of more gainful employment. As a result, there were significant differences between the 1945 Full Employment Bill and the eventual 1946 Employment Act. Proposals that established an affirmative full-time employment and a planning mechanism to achieve it, those were removed. But despite how the 1945 bill had its most transformative elements excised, the consensus for full employment was strong enough to pass the 1946 Employment Act. The law sought to establish more coherent economic planning in the interest of maximum employment. The quest for full employment would then evolve over the subsequent decades. As A. Philip Randolph set out to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in early 1963, the jobs component was at the forefront of his agenda. So much so that an initial name for the march was the Emancipation March for Jobs. Although it's most remembered for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech and its role in helping elicit the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, its central demand of full employment remains unfulfilled. This wasn't due to inadequate effort, but the challenges of achieving legislation. At the march, a number of the 250,000 people in attendance held signs reading, "Full employment plus civil rights equals freedom," a slogan conceptualized by Randolph himself. Many of those 250,000 people had undoubtedly read the organizing manual, which had emphasized the demands for, quote, "a massive federal public works programs to provide jobs for all the unemployed, and federal legislation to promote an expanding economy." Unfortunately, these demands went basically unacknowledged by those on Capitol Hill who might have been able to translate this vision into policy. These struggles would then continue over the following years, as many continued the fight for full employment. Rustin joined with left liberal economist Leon Kaiserling to propose the freedom budget for all Americans to reinvigorate the social welfare state. The freedom budget demanded guaranteed jobs or income for all, among much else. Well aware of the need to coordinate economic policy institutions, the freedom budget also emphasized that, quote, more effective public control over the Federal Reserve System was necessary. However, the freedom budget missed its brief window between 1964 and 1966, when conceivably a bill sponsored by Bobby Kennedy and Jacob Javits might have had a chance in Congress. The story of that struggle is a bit too long to get into here, but it laid the basis for the subsequent decades' efforts. In the wake of her husband's assassination, Coretta Scott King would become one of the most forceful advocates of these goals. Glancing at the political landscape in 1974, Scott King could see the growing urgency of the economic situation. The 1970s stagflation crisis was devastating for the most marginalized workers and their family. Accordingly, Scott King created the National Committee for Full Employment and Full Employment Action Council. Around the same time, legislators like Congressional Black Caucus and Watts Congressional Black Caucus leader Augustus Hawkins and Senator Hubert Humphrey were also working towards similar goals. Hawkins had been a key legislator behind Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited employment discrimination. But he knew a lesson that the lawyer and civil rights activist Pauli Murray had emphasized back in the 1940s, that true fair employment could only be achieved by real full employment. In October 1973, Hawkins helped to organize a conference between researchers and policymakers at UCLA. In his introductory remarks, Hawkins traced some of the legacies of the 1946 Employment Act and also pointed a path forward. Quote, 30 years ago, as the wartime election of 1944 came to a close, both Democrat and Republican candidates pledged themselves to jobs for all in the post-war period. Under the Employment Act, America took two important steps in the right direction. First, it expressed the country's determination never to tolerate a mass depression. Second, it set up the first beginnings of democratic machinery for national policymaking and planning. However, Hawkins noted that significant unemployment remained, especially for Black workers. Quote, the brutal fact remains that full employment levels achieved during World War II have never again been attained. One of the key impediments at the time to greater economic policy coordination was a Federal Reserve that was inattentive to both the policy implications of the Employment Act and even Congress itself. At the UCLA symposium, a senior economist for Congress's Joint Economic Committee complained that they had trouble getting even basic information from the Fed. Over the coming years, as the Fed raised interest rates and unemployment rates continued to ascend, Scott King's coalition continued to build their movement, while Hawkins and Humphrey drafted and introduced legislation to ameliorate the crisis of unemployment. Hawkins drew explicitly on the stifled efforts of prior years. As he explained, we must not replay the drama of events which led to the watering down and lessening of the full employment commitment contained in the Employment Act of 1946. 3 decades that have since passed, combined with the current situation, thrust before us the urgent need for a commitment to the goals of genuine full employment and the guaranteed right to a job for each individual who wants to work. Similarly, Scott King decried the situation. The unemployed are not pawns to be sacrificed in some economic chess game, she said. She told lawmakers at an Atlanta unemployment hearing, and she explained further, quote, accepting unemployment to control inflation amounts to choosing the people at the very bottom of the economic pyramid to bear the entire economic burden. In the so-called war against inflation, she said, America's 10 million unemployed have been the administration's conscript army. This conflict over democratic governance of economic life is one element that the Humphrey-Hawkins Act sought to settle. Some of this was reconciled in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977, which firmly established the Fed's employment mandate. As the director of the AFL-CIO's Department of Legislation testified in support of the act in July 1977, quote, "What irks us here is that the Fed is supposed to be a creature of Congress, but you have to dig pretty deep to find that out because the Fed has been acting so independent for years and years that sometimes you wonder if they know Congress exists. And for example, we have repeatedly said, if we are ever going to get a Humphrey Hawkins bill or any reasonable facsimile thereof, the Fed has got to be pulled into this fight for full employment." The Federal Reserve Reform Act was created in the context of Scott King's activism and more far-reaching proposals to alleviate the unemployment crisis coming from Senator Hubert Humphrey and Congressman Hawkins. Scott King's coalition sponsored a vibrant and successful Full Employment Action Week, which featured actions in 300 cities, mobilized over 1.5 million people in September 1977. The Massachusetts Coalition for Full Employment organized a solar heating and weatherizing work-in with building trades officials to show what types of work needed doing. And they began plans to coordinate with the environmental justice organizations, the Clamshell Alliance, and Science for the People to show how full employment could be utilized for new energy sources. In Des Moines, Iowa, a local coalition organized an unemployment hotline and began an unemployed people's union with the support of public sector workers. 60,000 people attended a 24-hour vigil in Buffalo where they signed petitions to deliver to President Carter. In Kansas City, where 25,000 people rallied for full employment, a member of the laborers union held a sign reading, "Jobs are human rights. We stand for full employment." And Erie, Pennsylvania had a full employment parade with 130 floats and 40,000 people came out to support. Congressman Hawkins believed that the organizing for the week of protest was the greatest seen since the March on Washington. After the tumultuous journey to become law, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act finally emphasized greater coordination between fiscal and monetary policy, which is to say, taxing and spending, and what the Federal Reserve does of setting interest rates. This was all towards the goal of crafting full employment. There was a tremendous fight about what precisely full employment actually meant, but the law stipulated that the unemployment rate be reduced to 3% for those over the age of 20 by 1983 and 4% for those over the age of 16. Humphrey Hawkins also demanded that, quote, "every effort be made to reduce disparities between the unemployment rates for youth, women, minorities, handicapped persons, veterans, middle-aged and older persons, and other labor market groups." However, most of these provisions have rarely been enforced with any degree of seriousness. Nevertheless, the law now required the Fed to submit semi-annual written reports about what they were doing to achieve the law's goals, as well as providing Congress with semi-annual testimony about their actions. During the press conference after the signing of the law, Coretta Scott King noted its significance. "This is indeed a historical occasion, perhaps as significant as the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Perhaps in the future, history will record that it may be even more significant, because I think it deals with an issue on a basic human right that's the most basic of all human rights, the right to a job." As Scott King illuminated, the law provided a compass to orient economic policymakers. However, this was not envisioned as the end of the journey. For Hawkins, Scott King, and many others who pursued full employment, the law was an important step, but it wasn't the last. After all, the law's proponents had granted numerous concessions during the legislative process, weakening the full employment mandate from a commitment to a goal, and scrapping the pledge that the government would be the employer of the last resort. As Scott King announced after its passage, Humphrey Hawkins is a vital first step. All of the gains of the movement my husband led in the 50s and 60s weren't established all at once. So she announced, "We'll be back in Washington year after year until there's full employment." More than 40 years after Humphrey Hawkins was signed into law, a full employment economy that fulfills Coretta Scott King's vision of racial and economic justice has yet to be achieved. Significant racial disparities in economic conditions persist. Humphrey Hawkins has demonstrated progress, however, by stipulating that monetary policy is a necessary part of the equation and by holding the Fed accountable to the ways that its policies impact unemployment. When one's in the midst of a struggle, it can be difficult to know that a victory might be on the horizon. Let's consider a speech that Bayard Rustin gave less than a month after the March on Washington. On the heels of his greatest success in almost 3 decades of consistent organizing, Rustin told his audience, quote, We are losing the fight, my friends, quickly. Where have we gained? Where have we made progress? This is a revolution which is succeeding. It is not. In September 1963, Rustin didn't know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were just on the horizon. In my more optimistic moments, I like to think that the 80-year-long struggle for full employment is in one of these moments. We are at one point in a long relay race, but we're getting closer in some key respects. When I started studying this history more than a decade ago, I wouldn't have imagined that the Democratic Party would put full employment back in the party platform, as it did in 2016 under pressure from activists. Coretta Scott King has passed the baton to groups like Policy Link, the Sunrise Movement, and politicians like Congresswoman Pressley. If and when the ongoing struggles are successful, the efforts of these prior organizers will cease to appear as failure and begin to appear as preparation. Thank you.